There is a photograph taken somewhere in England in the autumn of 1944. In it, a group of young men stand in front of a bomber. They are squinting into the sun. Some of them are grinning. One of them has his arms folded. Another has his cap pushed back on his head at the kind of angle that only young men who think they are going to live forever wear their caps. They are thin, they are pale, they are wearing flight jackets over their uniforms, and the jackets are too big on most of them because most of them have not yet finished growing into the men they were supposed to become. The man standing at the far right of the photograph is Glenn Rojon. He is 23 years old. He does not know that in a matter of weeks, on the last day of 1944, he will do something that no pilot in the history of aviation has ever done before or has ever done since. He does not know that decades later, people will write books about him, that his daughter will spend years of her life reconstructing every minute of a single afternoon that his name will be spoken with the same quiet reverence reserved for men who did the impossible and then went home and never talked about it. He is just a young man standing in a photograph squinting into the English sun with 3 missions left between him and the rest of his life. Next to him, just slightly to his left, is William Leake, co-pilot from Washington State. Leake has a different kind of face than Rojon. Where Rojon looks like someone who is already calculating the distance between where he is and where he needs to be, Leake looks like someone who is comfortable exactly where he is standing. They are not close friends in the way that men in novels are close friends. They are something more practical than that. They are the 2 people who keep each other alive every time they climb into a cockpit together. And that is a bond that goes deeper than friendship without needing to announce itself. Stand with that photograph for a moment. Look at those faces. Because in a few weeks, the world is going to ask something of these men that no training, no briefing, no amount of courage or skill or prayer could fully prepare them for. And before we follow them into that sky, we owe it to them to understand who they were when the sky was still ordinary. Glenn H. Rojon grew up on a farm in Greenock, Pennsylvania, a small community tucked in Elizabeth Township, southeast of Pittsburgh. This is important, not because there is anything romantic about a farm, but because of what a farm teaches you without ever sitting you down and teaching you anything at all. A farm teaches you that there is always something that needs doing and that no one else is going to do it for you. It teaches you that weather does not negotiate. It teaches you that when a piece of equipment breaks in the middle of something critical, you do not stop and mourn the broken piece. You figure out how to keep going without it. You adapt. You finish the job. You do not talk about it afterward because there is always more work tomorrow, and talking about yesterday does not help with tomorrow. Glenn Rojon's father ran a heating and cooling business alongside the farming. The family was not wealthy. They were not poor. They were the kind of people who built their lives out of what they had and did not spend much time thinking about what they did not have. In western Pennsylvania in the 1930s and early 1940s, that described most of the people you would meet on any given day. But there was one thing about Glenn Rojon that set him apart from the other young men who grew up in towns like Greenock, and it was not ambition in the conventional sense, and it was not a hunger for glory, and it was not some preordained sense of destiny. It was simpler than any of those things and more powerful than all of them. Every time a plane flew over the skies of western Pennsylvania, Glenn Rojon stopped what he was doing and watched it until it disappeared. Not for a second, not the way you glance up at a sound and then go back to what you were doing. He watched, he tracked, he stood still and followed that speck of metal across the sky until there was nothing left to follow, and then he kept looking at the place where it had been for just a moment longer, the way a person looks at a door after someone they love has walked through it. The other boys noticed. The adults in his life noticed. Nobody made too much of it because in those years in that part of Pennsylvania, you noticed things about a child and you filed them away quietly and you waited to see what the child would decide to do about them. Glenn Rojon decided to do something about it. He enlisted in the United States Army in October of 1942. He was 21 years old. He had one stated intention: he was going to be a bomber pilot, not a pursuit pilot, not a transport pilot, a bomber pilot. He wanted to fly the biggest aircraft the Army Air Forces put in the sky, and he wanted to fly them over the enemy, and he wanted to bring his crew home. 2 out of 3 of those things he would accomplish. To understand what happened on December 31st, you have to understand what December of 1944 was. 6 months after D-Day, the Allies were not winning the war as cleanly as the maps back home suggested. The liberation of France had gone better than anyone had dared hope in the planning rooms of London and Washington. Paris had fallen to the Allies in August. The German army was being pushed back on multiple fronts. There were men in Washington and London who were beginning to talk cautiously about the war being over before spring. And then, on December 16th, Hitler launched the Ardennes offensive. History would come to call it the Battle of the Bulge, and it was the last major German offensive of the entire war, and it was ferocious, and it was desperate, and it very nearly worked. 200,000 German troops punched through Allied lines in Belgium and Luxembourg in the middle of the worst winter the region had seen in a generation. American units were surrounded, entire towns were besieged. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that kills not just soldiers, but equipment, that freezes fuel lines and jams weapons and turns a man's certainty about the future into something thin and unreliable. The 8th Air Force was ordered to keep flying, maximum effort, every available aircraft, every available crew. The goal was to cut German supply lines, destroy fuel depots, hammer oil refineries, and make it as difficult as possible for the German army to sustain its offensive. This is the context in which Glenn Rojon and William Leake were woken at 4 o'clock in the morning on the last day of 1944 and told they were going to Hamburg. They had been scheduled for leave. This is not a small detail. After flying a series of missions in rapid succession, both men had been told they could rest, that they had earned it, that the operations schedule had space for them to breathe. And then the Battle of the Bulge changed the operations schedule, and maximum effort meant exactly what it said. Everyone flies. The leave was canceled. The knock came at 4 in the morning, and Rojon and Leake got up. The 100th Bomb Group 8th Air Force was based at Thorpe Abbotts, a Royal Air Force station in Norfolk, England. The group had been operating in the European theater since June of 1943. By late 1944, it had accumulated a reputation that was spoken about in hushed tones among American airmen throughout England. The nickname was the Bloody Hundredth. It had been earned the hard way. On September 11, 1944, while the rest of the war was grinding forward, the 100th Bomb Group lost 12 aircraft in a single mission to Ruland. 12. That is not a bad day. That is a catastrophe. Each of those aircraft carried 10 men. Do the arithmetic and you arrive at a number that explains why the word bloody was attached to the group's designation and why it stayed there. Rojon's crew had been transferred to the 100th Bomb Group in September of 1944, specifically because of those losses. The group needed bodies. It needed experienced crews who could be slotted into the depleted formations and keep the missions going. Rojon and his men were those bodies. Walking through the gates of Thorpe Abbotts for the first time, knowing the group's history, knowing why there were empty bunks and empty seats at the mess tables, and knowing that the men who had occupied those bunks and those seats had gone up and not come back, required a particular kind of deliberate not thinking that combat airmen had to master if they were going to defunction at all. Rojon mastered it. He filed the information away and focused on the work. This was December 31st, 1944. Mission 22 for Glenn Rojon. 3 more after this one, and he would have his 25, and he would be rotated home. He was that close. He was close enough that on quiet evenings, he probably let himself think about Pennsylvania, about the farm, about the ordinary sounds of a life that did not involve flak and formation flying, and the particular kind of arithmetic that combat airmen do constantly in their heads, the arithmetic of odds and distances and the number of people who had not come back. 3 more missions. After today, 2 more. The aircraft assigned to Rojon's crew was a Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress, serial number 4, 2-3-1987, given the nickname the Little Skipper, also known as Shillelagh. It was not a new aircraft. It had been delivered to the group in March of 1944, and by December it had the particular quality of a machine that has been through things, that has been repaired and patched and inspected and declared airworthy enough times that the word airworthy has begun to carry a slightly different weight than it did when the aircraft was new. The 10 men who flew in it on December 31st were not all strangers to each other, but they were not all old friends either. Combat crews had a way of acquiring replacement members as losses accumulated, And by late 1944, it was common for a crew to contain men who had started their tours together and men who had been dropped in from other units to fill gaps left by the ones who had not come back. Corporal Joseph L. Russo was the ball turret gunner. He was Italian-American, small in stature, which was not a coincidence. The ball turret was a spherical plexiglass and metal enclosure mounted on the underside of the B-17's fuselage, and it was barely large enough for a grown man to fold himself into. It was considered by almost everyone who flew in B-17s to be the most dangerous station on the aircraft for reasons that went beyond the obvious ones. The ball turret gunner was not just exposed, he was isolated. If the aircraft lost electrical power or hydraulic pressure, the turret could not be rotated into the position that would allow the gunner to exit. The only way out was through a manual hand crank, and if the hand crank failed, there was no other way. Every man who climbed into a ball turret knew this. It was the kind of knowledge you learned during training and then spent the rest of your tour not thinking about. Russo thought about it. He had to. It was his job to think about it, to know exactly what he would do if the power went out, to practice the hand crank procedure until it was muscle memory, to be at peace as much as a person can be at peace with the reality of the station he occupied. He was religious. He was the kind of man who carried his faith not as a decoration, but as a working piece of equipment, something he reached for the way a mechanic reaches for a wrench, something functional and reliable and present. Second Lieutenant Robert Washington was the navigator, and December 31st, 1944 was his 27th mission. This is a number worth sitting with. 27 missions. He was past the threshold at which most airmen were rotated home, which means he had been flying longer than the standard tour of duty required, which means he had been useful enough that the Army kept him flying while other men went home. He had come to Rojon's crew as a replacement attached from another unit, and his 27th mission would prove to be the last one before everything he thought he knew about what a mission could be was permanently revised. Technical Sergeant Orville E. Elkin served as both the top turret gunner and the flight engineer. He was methodical. He was the kind of man who, after the war, would sit down and write out what he had seen and experienced in careful, accurate prose, because the events he had lived through deserved accuracy, and he understood that. His post-war account of the December 31st mission is one of the primary sources through which we know what happened inside that aircraft. Technical Sergeant Edward G. Newhouse was the radio operator. Sergeant Roy H. Little was the waist gunner. Staff Sergeant Francis R. Chase was the tail gunner, a replacement who had been added to the crew not long before the mission. Sergeant James Shirley was the bombardier. These are the men. These are their names. Say them once before we go further. Glenn Rojon, William Leake, Joseph Russo, Robert Washington, Orville Elkin, Edward Newhouse, Roy Little, Francis Chase, James Shirley. 10 men, 1 aircraft. One morning that began like all the other mornings that December, and then became something else entirely. Somewhere in the same formation, flying the same sky, heading toward the same target, was a B-17G serial number 43-38457 called 9 Lives. The name was meant to suggest resilience, the idea that this aircraft and its crew could absorb what the enemy threw at them and keep flying, that they had reserves of luck and skill that would carry them through whatever the day presented. The pilot was Second Lieutenant William G. McNabb. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Nelson Vaughn. They were part of the same group, flying in the same formation, doing the same job. They were not close to Rojon in the way that later events would make it seem as though fate had been building toward a collision between these specific men for some time. They were simply 2 of the 37 pilots who took off from Thorpe Abbotts that morning and pointed their aircraft toward Germany. What we know about McNabb and Vaughn comes mostly from what did not survive. The front section of 9 Lives did not survive what was about to happen. The 2 men in the cockpit did not survive. Whatever they experienced in those final minutes, whatever they understood or did not understand about what was happening to their aircraft, is something that history cannot reach. The record goes silent at a certain point, and what the silence contains is something we can imagine, but never know. The crew records show that both pilots sustained wounds prior to the collision. This is the clinical way of saying that before 9 Lives became locked to the little skipper above it, before the 2 aircraft became one terrible hybrid machine and began their descent toward the German coast, McNabb and Vaughn had already been hit. By flak, by fighter fire, by something that had come through the aircraft and found them. The degree to which they were still conscious and in control of their aircraft in the minutes before impact is not known with certainty. What is known is that 9 lives began to drift. Not dramatically, not in the way a mortally wounded aircraft spirals and falls. It drifted the way a ship drifts when the hand on the wheel goes slack slowly and with a kind of terrible patience following the physics of its own momentum, its nose rising slightly as the controls went unattended. Rising toward the underside of the aircraft directly above it. At Thorpe Abbotts, the briefing for the December 31st mission began before dawn. The target was Hamburg, one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany, a port city on the Elbe River, with oil refineries, submarine construction facilities, and an anti-aircraft defense network that had been refined through years of experience shooting down Allied bombers. Navigator Washington remembered the start of it clearly. Takeoff that morning was delayed because of fog. This was not unusual in England in December. What was unusual was the message that arrived as the formation was assembling over the English Channel. The fighter escort had been delayed. The P-51 Mustangs that were supposed to accompany the bombers from the coast of England to the target and back, providing cover against German interceptors, were grounded by weather. They would not be there. The formation would proceed without them. This is the moment that the mission changed from a dangerous assignment into something closer to a sentence. 37 B-17s, each carrying a crew of 10 men, each loaded with 500-pound bombs, were going to fly deep into Germany to one of the most heavily defended cities on the continent without fighter escort. They were large aircraft. They were slow aircraft, at least compared to the German interceptors that would be scrambled to meet them. They were aircraft that depended on flying in tight formation so that their collective firepower could create overlapping fields of fire that made it difficult for attacking fighters to make clean runs. The formation was their defense. Tight formation in the combined guns of 37 aircraft. But they had to reach the target first. And between the English coast and Hamburg lay a lot of sky, and in that sky were German radar installations, German early warning networks, and German fighter bases from which hundreds of interceptors could be launched. Elkin would write about it afterward, with the kind of simplicity that comes from having lived through something so extreme, that exaggeration becomes unnecessary. Fighters coming from every direction, from 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock from below and from above, and the awareness that only 1/16th of an inch of aluminum stood between him and the firepower converging on the formation. 1/16th of an inch, the thickness of a credit card. That is what stood between the men inside those aircraft and everything that was being thrown at them. The formation reached Hamburg. The flak was, in the words of multiple post-war accounts, unlike anything the airmen had seen on previous missions. The German anti-aircraft batteries around Hamburg had been reinforced, repositioned, and resupplied. They were firing in coordinated patterns designed to fill the sky at the altitudes where the bombers flew, and they were doing so with an accuracy that reflected years of practice against exactly these kinds of targets. Bombers fell, not one or two. In the time it took the formation to reach the target, make its run, drop its bombs, and begin the turn back toward the North Sea, 12 of the 37 aircraft that had taken off from Thorpe Abbotts that morning were gone. More than 100 men gone. The remaining 25 aircraft, battered and depleted, turned northwest and began the long flight back. They tightened formation. In formation, there was protection. In formation, the combined guns of the surviving aircraft could at least make it costly for German fighters to press their attacks. In formation, there was the possibility of getting home. And then the German interceptors came. They came from bases at Bremen and Oldenburg. Messerschmitt B F-109s. Fast, experienced pilots who had been scrambled specifically to intercept the returning formation while it was weakened and without escort to hit it, while the men inside the surviving bombers were already exhausted and shaken, while the aircraft themselves were damaged and burning fuel at rates that shortened the time they had before they would have to choose between making it home and staying in the air. The formation that had left England with 37 aircraft was now something closer to a cluster than a formation. Gaps opened up as damaged bombers fell back or fell out. Those gaps were dangerous because a gap in the formation was an invitation. It was a space that a German fighter could fly through without passing through concentrated defensive fire. It was an opening in the armor. When a B-17 ahead of Rojon caught fire and began its long fall toward the earth, it left one of those gaps. Rojan gunned his engines and moved to fill it. This was what he had been trained to do. This was the correct action. You fill the gap. You close the formation. You do not leave a space for the enemy to exploit. He moved forward and left to take the position that the burning aircraft had just vacated. He was moving into that gap when the sky fell on him. He did not hear it coming. At 19,000 feet, in a formation of 25 heavy bombers all running their engines at combat power, with anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks filling the air with sound and smoke and confusion, there was nothing to hear. There was only the motion of the aircraft ahead of him disappearing into smoke, the gap opening up his own hand on the throttles, the nose of the little skipper angling forward to fill the void. And then an impact so severe that his hand was thrown from the throttle levers, that Leek's knees slammed into the instrument panel, that every instrument in the cockpit swung wildly, and the aircraft shuddered from nose to tail with a vibration that felt less like a collision and more like the aircraft was trying to come apart from the inside. Rojan's hands found the controls. His mind, working with the kind of terrible clarity that extreme danger sometimes produces, began to take inventory. The aircraft was still flying. The engines were still running. The controls were responding, though differently than before, with a heaviness and a resistance that did not belong there. Something had changed. Something fundamental about the aircraft had changed. He looked out to the left. He looked to the right. He looked behind him. And there, locked into the underside of his aircraft, its propellers still turning, one of its engines on fire, its tail slightly offset to the left of his own, was another B-17. 9 lives had risen into the little skipper from below. The top gun turret of the lower aircraft had punched up through the aluminum belly of Rojan's plane. The ball turret of Rojan's plane, the sphere where Joseph Russo was sitting, had been driven down through the roof of 9 lives and locked in place by the twisted metal of both aircraft compressing around it. 2 aircraft, 20 men, locked together at 19,000 feet above the North Sea, losing altitude on fire with no fighter escort over enemy territory, with the German coast on one side and the freezing waters of the North Sea on the other. Leek looked at the aircraft hanging below them. He looked at Rojan. He said what he saw. "Geez, Glenn, we're stuck together like mating dragonflies." Rojan did not laugh, but he understood with the same quiet precision with which he had understood everything that had ever been asked of him, exactly what was happening and exactly how little time they had and exactly what came next. He took stock. He had 10 men depending on him, possibly 20, if any of the 9 lives crew were still alive below. He had fire spreading along the lower aircraft's left wing. He had a ball turret gunner trapped in a position from which there was no exit. He had the sea on one side and the enemy on the other. He had 2 hands, 1 co-pilot, who had refused to leave a collection of instruments, some of which were still working, in a very small amount of time. He reached for what he had, and he went to work. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows catastrophe. Not quiet. Nothing about what was happening inside that cockpit was quiet. The engines of 9 lives were still running below them, 3 of the 4 still churning at combat power, their vibration transmitting up through the locked metal of the 2 fuselages and into the seats where Rojan and Leek sat. The wind at 19,000 feet was tearing past the gaps and fractures that the collision had opened in both aircraft. Somewhere in the lower plane, ammunition was beginning to cook in the heat of the spreading fire. The intercom was alive with voices, men calling out positions, calling out damage reports, calling out the things they were seeing from their stations that they needed the pilots to know. But underneath all of that noise, underneath the engines and the wind and the voices, there was something that felt like silence. The silence of 2 men in a cockpit who had just understood fully and without any possibility of misunderstanding exactly what they were dealing with. Rojan's hands were already moving. He reached for the throttles on the little skipper and pushed them forward, applying full power to his own engines, trying to drive his aircraft upward and away from the one locked beneath it. The B-17G had 4 Wright R1820 radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower at takeoff settings, and Rojan used all of it, pouring power into the propellers, willing the aircraft to climb to separate, to break free of the thing that had attached itself to its underside. The 2 aircraft did not separate. He tried it again. Leek, reading his intention without needing to be told, added his own inputs to the controls. Both men working together the way they had learned to work together, anticipating and complementing each other's movements. The combined effort of two experienced pilots and four functioning engines against the weight and inertia of a locked B-17 below them produced exactly nothing. The aircraft did not move. The lower plane did not release. Whatever geometry of twisted metal and interlocked components had been created by the collision it was holding with the indifference of physics. It did not care about the urgency of the men trying to undo it. Leake had described it later with precision. The outboard propeller on the left side of the little skipper had bent into the nacelle of the lower aircraft's engine during the collision. The Top Gun turret of 9 Lives had punched up through the aluminum belly of Rojan's plane and was now jammed in place by the compressed metal surrounding it. The ball turret of the little skipper, the sphere where Russo was stationed, had been driven downward through the roof of 9 Lives and was held there by the same compression of metal from both sides. Two aircraft, locked by their own damage into a configuration that no one had designed and that no manual had anticipated, that no training had prepared anyone to solve. Rojan tried to rock the combined aircraft, applying differential power to the engines on one side, and then the other, attempting to create a rolling motion that might break the connection. Nothing. He tried reducing power to idle and then slamming it back to full, hoping that the sudden change in thrust might shock the two aircraft apart. Nothing. Each attempt that failed was a few more seconds of altitude, lost a few more feet of separation between the aircraft and the ground, a few more inches of fire advancing along the lower wing. He stopped trying to separate them. This was the first decision, and it was the right one, and it required a kind of discipline that most people do not possess, and that combat pilots develop through the particular education of repeatedly doing dangerous things and surviving them. The discipline of knowing when to stop trying the thing that is not working and start trying the thing that might. Rojan filed away the fact that separation was not going to happen and moved immediately to the next problem. The next problem was fire. The fourth engine of 9 Lives, the one that had been struck by Rojan's bent propeller during the collision, was burning. Not smoldering, not producing smoke with some fire at its center, burning with the particular ferocity of aviation fuel and lubricating oil, and the electrical systems of a large aircraft, all contributing to a fire that had every material it needed to grow and nothing to stop it. From the cockpit of the little skipper, Rojan could see the fire. He could see it through the windscreen, and the side windows see it painting the left side of his field of vision with orange and black. He could feel it. The aluminum skin of his aircraft, thin enough that you could dent it with a firm push, was conducting heat from the burning aircraft below into the fuselage around him, and the heat was becoming something that could be felt on exposed skin. The bystanders on the ground below German anti-aircraft crews, who had been tracking this strange double aircraft across the sky, would later report that it looked like a creature on fire, like something alive and in pain, moving across the horizon, trailing smoke and shedding burning fragments as it went. Rojan made the second decision. He reached forward and shut down his own engines. All four of them. The throttles came back to idle. The mixture controls went to cut off, the magneto switches went off, and the four right radials that had been pulling the little skipper through the sky wound down and stopped. The propellers slowed and feathered. The reasoning was exact. His engines were adding thrust that he could not currently use to escape the locked aircraft below him. But they were also adding heat. They were also adding the risk that if the fire from 9 Lives reached his fuel tanks, his own engines would provide additional material for the explosion. By shutting his engines down, he reduced the fire risk to his aircraft. He also reduced the noise, which is a strange thing to think about. But in that cockpit with the intercom full of voices and the structure groaning around them, reducing the noise by shutting his own engines down clarified the situation in a way that was useful. Now they were flying on the three remaining engines of 9 Lives. The engines of the aircraft below them, the aircraft that was on fire, the aircraft whose pilots were almost certainly dead. The engines of the enemy, in a sense, because it was German fire and German fighters that had brought 9 Lives to this condition. And yet here they were, kept in the air by those three churning propellers below, held aloft by the power of an aircraft that had no one alive at its controls. This was the situation. 19,000 feet. Losing altitude, the North Sea to the northwest, and the German coast somewhere to the east. Fire on the left. 10 men in 2 aircraft, which was now 1 aircraft, which was now something that had no name. Rojan looked at Leake. Leake looked at Rojan. Neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched. While the 2 pilots and the little skipper were working through the physics of their situation, The men in the body of both aircraft were working through their own. In the ball turret of 9 Live Staff Sergeant Edward L. Woodall, Jr. had felt the collision above him as a shock that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a compression and a shudder that rattled every surface of the small metal sphere he occupied. Then the power went out. Electrical power gone. Hydraulic pressure gone. The turret, which under normal circumstances could be rotated by electric motor into the exit position, was now a dead mechanism hanging in the cold air below the fuselage of a burning aircraft. Woodall remembered his training, not because training had prepared him for this specific situation, because nothing had prepared anyone for this specific situation, but because training had given him a protocol for the general situation of losing power in the ball turret, and a protocol was something to hold on to when the alternative was nothing. He reached for the hand crank. He found it in the dark by feel because he had practiced finding it by feel because the training had anticipated the possibility that you might need to use it when you could not see. He engaged it. He began to turn. The turret weighed several hundred pounds. The hand crank was not designed for speed. It was designed for the situation where there was no other option, where a man needed to move several hundred pounds of metal, a precise number of degrees in order to align the exit hatch with the opening in the fuselage above him, and where speed was less important than getting it right. Woodall turned the crank in the dark with the fire spreading above him and the ground somewhere below him, and the knowledge that the distance between those two things was getting smaller with each passing second. The turret moved, slowly, degree by degree, with the kind of effort that uses every muscle in the arms and shoulders and back. Simultaneously, the guns rotated toward the straight-down position. When they reached it, Woodall released the hatch. He folded himself out of the turret backwards the way he had practiced and pulled himself up into the fuselage of 9 Lives. He stood up in the smoking interior of the lower aircraft and looked forward toward the cockpit. He could not see McNabb or Vaughn. He could see the state of the aircraft, which was telling him everything he needed to know about why the aircraft had behaved as it had in the moments before the collision. And then he looked up. Through the top of the fuselage, which had been breached by the impact, he could see another ball turret. It was not his. It belonged to the aircraft above. It had been driven through the roof of 9 Lives by the collision, and it was wedged there by the compressed and twisted metal of both fuselages pressing against it from all sides, and it was not going to move. Inside it, visible through the plexiglass, was a man. The man was Joseph Russo. He was making the sign of the cross. In the cockpit of the little skipper, the intercom carried voices from all stations. Updates on the fire. Updates on damage. The navigator Washington making his way forward to assess the situation. Elkin at his top turret station reporting what he could see. The normal chaos of a crew managing an emergency, each man doing his job, each voice adding to the picture that Rojan was assembling in his mind. And then underneath all the other voices, a different kind of voice. Russo had not announced that he was going to pray. He had not keyed his intercom deliberately with the intention of broadcasting. What the crew of the little skipper heard was a man talking to himself or to God in the only way he knew how to address what was happening to him, and he was doing it over an open intercom without knowing that every man on the aircraft could hear him. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." The voice was not panicked. It was not the voice of a man screaming or weeping or losing himself in the face of what he understood. It was steady. It was the voice of a man doing the thing he had always done in moments of extremity, reaching for the familiar words the way Woodall had reached for the hand crank in the dark, by feel, by practice, by the accumulated weight of repetition over a lifetime. "Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus." Leek heard it. He said nothing about it at first. He kept his hands on the controls, kept working with Rojan to manage the descent, kept doing the mechanical work that needed to be done. But the voice continued, steady and unhurried, coming through the intercom, the way a signal comes through static, clear and unmistakable underneath everything else. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death." Leek reached up and removed his flying helmet. He did it carefully, the way you do something that requires a moment of deliberate action in a situation where everything around you is demanding immediate reaction. He took the helmet off with its earphones and its intercom connection, and he set it down. He said later that he felt he was intruding, that Russo's prayers were private in a way that the open intercom had made accidentally public, and that listening felt like a violation of something that deserved to be unwitnessed. He said that removing the helmet was the hardest single thing he did during the entire experience, not the physical effort of holding two aircraft on course, not refusing Rojan's order to jump, removing the helmet and accepting that there was a man behind him who was preparing to die and that there was nothing Lee could do about it. He flew without the intercom. He flew by watching Rojan's hands and Rojan's eyes and the instruments in front of him, and he flew by feel, and the prayers continued behind him, audible now, not through the intercom but through the thin aluminum of the fuselage, faint and steady, like something that had always been there. Elkin, Newhouse, and Little made their way through the fuselage of the little skipper toward the ball turret position. They understood what had happened to it. They understood what the collision had done. They were carrying the hand crank that was supposed to allow a manual rotation of the turret, the same tool that Woodall had used successfully in 9 Lives Below Them, and they intended to use it. They could not. The turret had not merely been driven downward through the breach in the lower aircraft's roof. It had been caught there, seized by the compression of metal from both aircraft pressing against it from all sides. And the forces involved were not the forces that a hand crank was designed to overcome. The turret housing that was supposed to rotate was locked in a grip of twisted aluminum and steel that 3 men working together at the absolute limit of their physical strength could not break. Elkin wrote about it afterward. The words he used were simple: it would not move. There was no means of escape for this brave man. They stayed at it longer than the situation perhaps warranted, which is to say they stayed at it until they were absolutely certain, until there was no angle they had not tried and no amount of force they had not applied. And when they finally accepted what the metal was telling them, they straightened up and looked at each other in the smoke and the noise and the orange light coming through the fuselage openings, and then they looked at Russo. He was still praying. He could see them through the plexiglass. He made the sign of the cross again slowly and deliberately and continued. They moved to the tail door. Rojan had been building toward a decision that he did not want to make and that he could not avoid making. He could not stay over the North Sea. The sea was death for anyone who survived a bailout into it. The temperature of the water in December was cold enough to kill an unprotected man in under 30 minutes. And the men jumping from the little skipper would not have survival suits, and they would not have immediate rescue. They would have parachutes and the sea, and however long the cold allowed them. It was not enough. He needed land. German land was the only land available. He needed to turn the 2 locked aircraft, this impossible hybrid of metal and fire, and dead men and living men, away from the North Sea and back toward the German coast he had just crossed. He needed to fly it over enemy territory into the guns of the anti-aircraft batteries that had already sent 12 B-17 to the ground that day, and find a place where his crew could jump and land on solid earth and be taken prisoner rather than drowning in a cold sea. Being taken prisoner meant surviving. Surviving meant that someday when the war ended, the men who bailed out over Germany would go home. The mathematics of it were not complicated. Rojan cut power to his remaining engines, the ones he had already shut down, to reduce the fire risk further. He worked the controls. The combined aircraft's 7 engines running between the 2 of them, with 1 on fire and the 8th already dead, began to respond, not quickly, not cleanly, not. The aerodynamics of the configuration he was flying had never been studied, because the configuration had never existed before, and every input to the controls produced results that were related to, but not identical to what those inputs would have produced in an undamaged aircraft. He worked with what he had. The 2 aircraft, locked together and burning and losing at altitude, began a long, grinding turn back toward the southeast, back toward Germany, back toward the coast, in the fields, in the towns, and the German soldiers who would be waiting for whatever came down. Washington, the navigator, had made his way to the cockpit to see the situation for himself. He looked at the 2 pilots braced against their seats, feet against the instrument panel, pulling back on the controls with sustained physical effort, veins visible in their forearms, faces set with the particular expression of men doing something that requires everything they have and slightly more. He looked through the windscreen at the configuration of aircraft and fire and smoke that they were flying. He went back through the bomb bay and out the waste door. He pulled his ripcord. One by one, as the combined aircraft completed its turn and began to cross back over the German coast, the crew of the little skipper made their way to the tail and jumped. Shirley followed Washington. Elkin, Newhouse, Little, Chase. 6 men out the door into the cold air, into whatever was waiting for them below. Russo could not jump. He was still in the turret. He was still praying. The aircraft that he was part of that he could not leave was descending toward German soil. The crew had jumped, 6 men out. Russo was gone in a different way, a way that Rojan could not address and could not change a fact that he had put into the category of things that had already been decided by circumstances and that did not therefore require a decision from him, because the only decisions he could make now were the ones that still had outcomes he could influence. There was one man left in the aircraft besides Rojan himself. Leek was still in the co-pilot seat. He had put his helmet back on. He was flying. Rojan gave the order. He gave it clearly and directly and with the authority of a senior officer and the urgency of a man who understood that the window for jumping was closing. Go. Now. That was the order. Get to the tail door and jump. Leek did not move. He did not move because he had already worked through the problem. He had done the same arithmetic that Rojan had done, the same calculation of forces and outcomes, and he had arrived at a conclusion that Rojan had not yet arrived at or had not allowed himself to arrive at because it was a conclusion that required someone else to accept a specific cost. One man could not fly the combined aircraft alone. This was not a judgment about Rojan's ability or his strength or his will. It was a statement about the physics of what was happening. The combined aircraft's 7 engines and the weight of 2 B-17 fuselages and the irregular aerodynamics of a configuration that had no precedent required 2 people to manage. 2 sets of hands on 2 sets of controls, working continuously against the tendency of the whole thing to roll and yaw and pitch in ways that would send it into an unrecoverable spiral with his seconds of one pilot trying to manage it alone. If Leek jumped, Rojan would lose control before he could reach the tail door. He would go into the spiral. He would not recover. He would die inside the aircraft. Leek knew this. He had known it before Rojan gave the order. He had been sitting with the knowledge of it since the moment the crew started jumping, since the moment the aircraft got lighter with each man out the door, and the controls got more responsive in ways that told him exactly how much of the control effort was his and how much of it Rojan could sustain alone. Rojan gave the order again. Leek said 4 words. I am staying, Glenn, not as a discussion, not as a request for permission, as a statement of fact delivered in the same tone that a man uses when he is telling someone something that has already been decided and that he has already made peace with and that he does not intend to revisit. Rojan looked at him. There are no surviving accounts of what passed between them in that moment because neither man described it in detail afterward, and the things that are not described in detail afterward are sometimes the things that went deepest. What is known is that Rojan turned back to the instruments and Leek kept flying, and the 2 men who had taken off together from Thorpe Abbotts that morning and who had been told they were going home after 3 more missions were now descending together toward German soil in an aircraft that was on fire and falling and unlike anything that had ever flown before. The German coast passed beneath them. The fields of northern Germany spread out ahead. The anti-aircraft batteries that had been tracking them, the batteries whose crews had watched this impossible 8-engine, burning double aircraft cross the coast and had concluded that those poor souls did not have a hope, had stopped firing. The ground was rising. The altimeter was unwinding. The fire on the lower wing was spreading into new material with each passing second. Rojan and Leek braced their feet against the instrument panel. They pulled back on the controls. They flew. Below them, locked in a turret of metal that would not move, Russo continued to pray. Above them, the sky that had started the day cold and gray and ordinary was now filled with smoke that was theirs trailing behind them across the German horizon like a signature written in fire and aluminum, and the last few hundred feet of altitude between them and the earth. The last few hundred feet are always the longest. This is something that pilots know and that the rest of us only understand in the abstract, the way we understand things that we have read about but never inhabited. The physics of a descent are constant. The rate of fall does not change because the men inside the falling thing are aware of it. The altimeter does not slow its unwinding out of consideration for what is at stake. The ground does not move. The ground simply waits as it has always waited with the absolute patience of something that has never needed to hurry because everything eventually comes to it. At some point in those final minutes with the German coast behind them and the fields of the region around Wilhelmshaven spreading out beneath the cracked windscreen of the little skipper, Glenn Rojan would have done the arithmetic one final time. Not the arithmetic of altitude and airspeed and rate of descent, though he was doing that continuously and automatically, the way a pilot does without consciously directing the calculation. The other arithmetic. The arithmetic of what was going to happen when the two locked aircraft reached the ground, and what the probabilities were for the two men still inside the upper one, and what, if anything, could be done to change those probabilities in the seconds remaining. The answer to the last question was almost nothing. They could keep the aircraft as level as possible. They could keep it from rolling into a spiral. They could aim for open ground rather than buildings or trees or bodies of water. They could hold on. That was the sum total of what remained available to them. Leek had his feet braced against the instrument panel. Rojan had his feet braced against the instrument panel. Both men were pulling back on their respective controls with everything left in their arms and shoulders and backs, which after the sustained effort of the preceding minutes was not as much as it had been when the day started, but was still more than most men have ever been asked to produce. The fire on the lower wing had spread further. The ammunition stored in 9 Lives was cooking off in the heat rounds, detonating in the burning fuselage and sending fragments outward in random directions, the aircraft below them firing its own guns without a gunner and without a target, spending its last remaining ordnance on the German sky. From the ground, the observers who had tracked this double aircraft across the coast reported that it appeared to be shooting at nothing, that it was a burning machine discharging itself into the air around it, as though in the grip of some mechanical final convulsion. Rojan kept flying. The aircraft crossed the final line of altitude, and the ground came up, and 9 leaves the lower aircraft, the aircraft with the dead pilots and the spreading fire, and the 3 engines still running, struck the earth first. The impact was not a landing. It was a collision between a large piece of metal moving at significant speed and a surface that does not compress or absorb or yield. The fuselage of 9 Lives crumpled from the nose backward as the kinetic energy of the descent found its way through the aircraft's structure in the fraction of a second that the impact lasted, and the fuel that had not already burned found ignition sources that the impact created, and 9 Lives exploded. The explosion was violent enough that witnesses on the ground who had been watching the descent from distances they believed were safe found themselves reconsidering their positions. The fireball expanded outward and upward, with the force of aviation fuel and ordnance detonating simultaneously, and the structure of the aircraft that had been 9 Lives became fragments, moving outward at speeds that turned metal into something closer to shrapnel. But the explosion also did something that no one had calculated, that no one could have predicted, that was the product of a specific combination of forces at a specific moment, and that was more improbable than almost anything else in a day that had been defined by the improbable. It threw the little skipper upward. The energy that the explosion released did not only go outward and downward. Some portion of it went up into the underside of the aircraft that had been locked to 9 Lives, and that upward force was sufficient to break the connection that the collision had created, and that every effort of the pilots had failed to break, and the little skipper, momentarily free of the aircraft it had been carrying, was vaulted back into the air. Not for long, not with any grace or controllability. The aircraft went up in the way that things go up when they are thrown rather than flown, without lift, without thrust, without anything guiding it except the direction of the force that had launched it. But it went up and then it came down again, and that single interval of separation from the explosion below was the difference between the aircraft being consumed in the fireball and the aircraft hitting the ground on its own terms, 100 or 200 feet from where 9 Lives had burned. The left wing struck something on the way down. A wooden structure, a building of some kind, and the wing cut through it the way a blade cuts through something softer than itself, and the impact transferred energy through the wing into the fuselage. And the fuselage cracked, and the nose of the little skipper separated from the rest of the aircraft and continued forward along the ground, decelerating through the dirt and debris of whatever it was passing through until the forces that had been driving it forward were exhausted and the motion stopped. Silence. Not the silence between artillery rounds, not the silence between engine sounds. Actual silence, the kind that comes after all the machinery has stopped and the fire has not yet found its voice, and the dust is still settling, and the smoke is still moving, and there is a moment when the world seems to pause and consider what has just happened. In the nose section of the little skipper in the cockpit that had somehow remained largely intact through everything that the last 30 minutes had delivered, 2 men were alive. Rojan and Leek sat in the wreckage of the cockpit and looked at each other. Everything aft of the cockpit was gone. The fuselage that had carried their crew, the waist positions, the radio room, the tail section where their men had jumped, all of it was either destroyed in the impact or had separated during the landing sequence and lay somewhere behind them in the German field. What remained was the nose of the aircraft, the cockpit, the instrumentation that had guided them to this moment, and the two men who had been pulling back on the controls until the controls no longer mattered. Neither man was seriously injured. This requires a moment of consideration because it is not the kind of statement that follows naturally from the description of what had happened. A mid-air collision at 19,000 feet, a locked descent over enemy territory in a burning dual aircraft configuration, an explosion that threw them back into the air, a second impact that destroyed most of the fuselage and sent the nose sliding across German soil until it stopped. And the two men in the cockpit had cuts. They had bruises. They had the kind of physical damage that the human body sustains when it is subjected to sustained violence within a harness in a structure that, however compromised, still provided some measure of protection. They were alive, both of them, neither badly hurt. Leak moved first. He found a gap in the fuselage structure behind the cockpit, a hole that the impact had opened in the aluminum, large enough for a man to push himself through. He got his hands on the edges of it and pulled himself forward and out, dropping down onto the German earth and straightening up and standing in the cold air of December 31st, 1944, which was the last day of the worst year most people alive had ever experienced, and he was standing on it. He reached into his uniform pocket. He found the cigarette pack that he had been carrying, the way combat airmen carried things they might need, the small, reliable comforts that traveled with them on every mission. He took a cigarette out. He placed it between his lips. He reached for his lighter. A rifle barrel appeared approximately 2 inches from the bridge of his nose. The German soldier holding it was young, and his face contained the specific combination of expressions that belongs to a person who has just watched something descend from the sky that he did not have a category for, and who is now confronting one of the men who had been inside it, and who is not entirely certain which of his reactions to trust. The soldier was scared. He was also alert. He grabbed the cigarette from between Leak's lips and pointed downward toward the ground, toward the aviation fuel that was pouring out of the ruptured wing tanks and spreading across the surface around them. Leak looked down. He looked at the fuel. He looked at the lighter in his hand. He put the lighter away. From the little skipper, 10 men had been aboard when the collision occurred. Of the 6 who jumped, 4 survived the jump and were taken prisoner. 2 did not survive. Roy Little and Francis Chase, whose parachutes had carried them out over a combination of sea and hostile terrain, did not make it to the ground alive. Nothing was ever found of them. Corporal Joseph Russo, who could not jump, whose ball turret had been locked into the fuselage of 9 lives by the collision and could not be freed by any effort his crewmates made, was gone with the aircraft. His body was never recovered. The American Air Museum records his status as killed in action body, not found. From 9 lives, the accounting was similarly incomplete and similarly costly. William McNabb and Nelson Vaughn, the pilot and co-pilot, had died either from their wounds before the collision or in the collision itself. Henry Etheridge, the radio operator, did not survive. Dwayne Wrench and Francis Seyfried, who had managed to get out of the aircraft whose parachutes had opened, had come down over the North Sea and drowned in water that gave them no chance. Their bodies were recovered later, or not at all. 4 men from 9 lives survived. Navigator Jack Berkowitz and bombardier Raymond Comer, who had been attached from another crew, had jumped and landed and been taken. Joseph Chadwick, the top turret engineer, and Edward Woodall, the ball turret gunner, who had cranked himself out of his turret in the dark and then stood inside the burning aircraft and looked at Russo through the plexiglass of the upper turret, had both come down in the water near the coast. Both had reached the shore. Both had been captured. 10 survivors total. 10 men who would spend the remainder of the war as prisoners of the German military, who would be fed and sheltered and interrogated and moved between camps as the Allied advance pushed the front lines eastward, who would survive to see the war end and to go home, which was the thing they had been trying to do when the day began. Rojan himself would remain a prisoner until May of 1945, 5 months after the crash. 5 months in which he would be interrogated and processed and assigned to a camp, and given the particular education in waiting that prisoners of war receive, the education in making a life inside constraint, in finding the dimensions of the space available, and occupying it with whatever dignity the circumstances allowed. His mother saved his letters from the camp. She kept every one of them for the rest of her life. Before Rojan reached a permanent camp, before the routine of imprisonment settled over him, and the days began to take on the texture of days rather than the texture of crisis, there were 2 weeks of interrogation. The Germans did not believe the crash had been an accident. This is understandable when you consider what they had seen. What they had tracked across their radar screens and observed from their coastal batteries was an 8-engine aircraft of a type that did not exist in any inventory. They were aware of an aircraft that appeared to have been deliberately designed with one fuselage on top of another, that had been flying with apparent control and purpose over their coastline, that had been firing weapons from multiple positions simultaneously, and that had finally come down in their territory after a flight that had lasted far longer than a mortally damaged aircraft should have been able to sustain. The most logical explanation from the German perspective was that they had witnessed the operational deployment of a new American weapon. A secret aircraft, a prototype that had been sent on a mission and had failed, and whose crew was now in their hands, and whose technical details could potentially be extracted through the standard processes of interrogation. They asked Rojan about the design. They asked about the second fuselage. They asked who flew the lower aircraft and who flew the upper one, and how the controls were coordinated between the two crews, and what the mission purpose of the configuration had been. They asked these questions with the persistence of people who had a specific answer in mind and were waiting for the questions to eventually produce it. Rojan told them what had happened. He told them about the formation and the gap and the collision and the locked aircraft and the fire. He told them with the same steady patience that he brought to everything, because the truth was simpler and more complete than any cover story, and because the truth was in this particular case more unbelievable than anything a prisoner might invent, and the Germans could verify it against the physical evidence of the wreckage if they chose to do so. It took 2 weeks for the interrogators to accept it. They walked through the wreckage themselves. They spoke with the German soldiers and civilians who had witnessed the descent. They compared the structural details of what had come down with what they knew about American aircraft designs. And eventually, with the reluctant precision of people who have been confronted with a fact that does not fit their expectations, but that cannot be argued with, they concluded that what they had seen was exactly what Rojan had described. An accident. An accident so improbable that it looked like a weapon. An accident in which two aircraft had locked together at altitude, and the men inside them had managed to fly the combined structure for long enough to save some of themselves before the whole thing came apart on German soil. They processed him as a prisoner of war and sent him to a camp. Glenn Rojan came home to Greenock, Pennsylvania in 1945. The farm was still there. The hills of Elizabeth Township were still the same hills he had watched as a child, with the same light falling across them in the evenings, the same quality of quiet that small communities in western Pennsylvania have always had, and that the war, for all its capacity to change things, had not reached. He did not talk about Hamburg. He did not talk about the collision or 9 lives or the locked aircraft or the fire or the prayers he had heard over the intercom. He did not talk about William Leake or Joseph Russo or the 2 weeks of German interrogation or the 5 months as a prisoner. He came home and he joined his father's heating and cooling business in McKeesport, and he married and he had children, and he built a life from the materials that were available to him. His son David and his daughter Cindy grew up knowing that their father had served in the war, knowing that he had been a bomber pilot, knowing in the vague and general way that children know things about their parents, that the parents do not fully explain that something had happened, something significant, something that their father had put somewhere inside himself where it lived without being discussed. At family gatherings, when the subject of the war came up, Rojan would sometimes shift slightly in his seat, and sometimes he would change the subject, and sometimes he would say something brief and factual and then move on. He was not a man who carried visible damage. He was not a man who seemed haunted in the ways that war is supposed to haunt people with nightmares and instability and the inability to function in civilian life. He functioned, he worked, he raised his children. He was by every observable measure a man who had come through something terrible and come out the other side and was now living on the other side in the ordinary world, doing ordinary things. But he wore the Distinguished Flying Cross he had been awarded for his actions on December 31st, 1944, without talking about what he had done to earn it. He accepted the Air Medal and the Purple Heart that accompanied it with the same quiet. The medals existed. They sat in whatever drawer or box or case he kept them in. They were not displayed in the prominent way that a man who wanted acknowledgement would display them. They were simply their evidence of something that he had decided did not need to be explained. The war had given him two things that he seems to have understood were related to each other. It had given him the Distinguished Flying Cross, which was the official recognition of what he had done. And it had taken from him the career as a pilot that he had planned his life around, because when the war ended, the desire to fly, which had defined him from childhood, which had driven every choice that put him in that cockpit, had been replaced by something he never specifically described, but that his family understood as a resolved and permanent preference for the ground. He stayed on the ground. He worked in heating and cooling. He was by all accounts good at it, the same quiet competence in a domestic trade that he had shown at altitude, with far higher stakes attached to the outcome. Decades passed. At some point, the question of William Leake began to press against the silence that Rojan had maintained. Not the question of what had happened. He knew what had happened. He had been there for all of it, and he carried the complete version of events inside him with the accuracy of a man who had never permitted himself the luxury of misremembering. The question was simpler and more human than that. It was the question of whether Leake was alive and where he was, and whether the thing that needed to be said between them had ever been going to find a way to be said, or whether it was simply going to remain one of the things that had happened between people and been absorbed by the distance and the years and the silence that follows extraordinary events when the extraordinary people who lived through them return to ordinary lives. Rojan went through government records. He wrote letters. He made inquiries through the veterans organizations that existed to help men from the same units find each other, the networks of shared experience that the war had created and that persisted afterward in reunions and newsletters and the careful maintenance of unit histories. He followed leads that went nowhere. He found addresses that were no longer current and names that led to different people and records that had been filed in ways that made them difficult to connect to the living human being he was trying to locate. He spent years doing this, not continuously, not to the exclusion of everything else, but with the persistence of a man who has decided that a thing needs to be done and who is willing to give it as much time as necessary. He was not looking for Leake because he needed to revisit the past. He was looking for him because Leake had stayed in a burning aircraft when the order to jump had been given, and because that act deserved to be acknowledged directly by the man who had benefited from it in person and words before the opportunity was gone. It took 40 years. In 1986, Rojan found a telephone number for Leake's mother in Washington State. He called it. A woman answered. He asked if her son was William Leake, who had served as a co-pilot in the 100th Bomb Group in 1944. She said yes, he was her son. She said he was visiting from California as it happened. She asked if Rojan would like to speak with him. The conversation that followed is not recorded. Neither man described it in detail afterward, and the people who knew them both understood instinctively that asking about it in detail was not something that would be welcome. What is known is that the call was made and that contact was reestablished, and that the two men who had held two aircraft level over German soil on the last day of 1944 were now speaking to each other for the first time since they had been separated by German soldiers in the wreckage of what had been the Little Skipper. The following year, in 1987, they met in person, a reunion of the 100th Bomb Group in Long Beach, California. Two old men in a room full of old men who had all been young men once in England in the cold winter of 1944. Whatever they said to each other in that room is also not recorded, but they were there together. After 40 years of silence and searching, they were in the same room. William G. Leake Jr. died in 1988, 1 year after the reunion, 1 year after Rojan finally found him. The window had been open for exactly 1 year, and then it closed. Glenn Rojan was the last survivor of the Piggyback flight. In the years between finding Leake and his own death in 2003, Rojan spoke about the events of December 31st, 1944, with slightly more openness than he had permitted himself in the preceding decades. Not much more. He was not transformed by the reunion into a man who wanted to stand up and tell the story to anyone who would listen. He was still the man from the farm in Greenock, still the man who believed that what needed doing should be done, and that the doing of it was sufficient without requiring extensive discussion afterward. but he was occasionally asked directly, and he occasionally answered. He did not talk about the distinguished flying cross with any enthusiasm. When people brought it up when they cited the citation language that described his airmanship and his coolness under pressure, and his role in saving the lives of members of his crew, he received it with the particular discomfort of someone who finds that the official version of a story leaves out the part that mattered most. The part that mattered most was leak. He said it in the way that a man says a thing that he has believed for a long time and that he has finally found both the occasion and the words for. He said it simply without decoration in the direct language of someone who spent his life doing practical work and who understood that the right words for a practical truth are usually the plain ones. In all fairness to my co-pilot, he is the reason I'm alive today. That was it. That was the full extent of the official statement on the subject from Glenn H. Rojon. Not a speech, not a letter, not a detailed accounting of what Leak had done and why it had mattered and what the alternatives would have produced. Just that sentence which contained everything that needed to be said and nothing that did not. In all fairness to my co-pilot. The phrase is interesting. In all fairness, as though there was a version of the story in which Rojon might have received credit for his own survival without the qualification, and he was insisting on the qualification, insisting that the credit be distributed accurately, that the record reflect what had actually happened, rather than a version that was simpler or more individual or more convenient. He is the reason I am alive today. Not was, is present tense even decades later, because the act that Leak had performed on December 31st, 1944, continued to be operative in every day that followed it. Every morning that Rojon woke up in McKeesport and went to work in the heating and cooling business, and came home and ate dinner and lived the unremarkable life that the remarkable survival of that afternoon had made possible, William Leak was the reason for it. The debt did not diminish with time. It did not become historical. It remained present, something alive in the current tense, because the life it had preserved was still being lived. Glenn Rojon died on August 9, 2003, at the age of 81, and was buried at Peace Lutheran Cemetery in Greenock, Pennsylvania, the town where he had been born and where he had watched planes cross the sky as a child, and where the quiet that he had returned to after the war received him finally and permanently. His daughter Cindy had begun in the years before his death, and with greater intensity after it, to do what her father had not done. She gathered, she researched, she contacted the families of the other men, the archives that held the mission records, the historians who had spent careers reconstructing the events of that December and placing them in the larger context of the air war over Europe. She found the statements that Elkin and Leak and Washington had given to researchers and journalists over the years. She found the mission logs and the MACR reports and the casualty records that were the official language in which the Army had translated the events of December 31st into bureaucratic documentation. And she found the letters, the ones her grandmother had kept. The letters that Glenn Rojon had written from the prisoner of war camp, the letters that his mother had received in Pennsylvania while she was waiting to know whether her son was alive, and which she had held on to for the rest of her life, with the devotion of someone who understood that they were not merely correspondence, but evidence of survival proof in his own handwriting that he had made it, that he was there, that he was coming home. In 2018, Cindy Rojon published a book. The title was The Piggyback Flight Pilot's Journey. It contained 260 photographs, including mission logs, witness statements, those letters from the camp, photographs of the aircraft and the crews and the men whose names appear in this account. It was, among other things, an act of retrieval, the recovery of a story that had been held inside one family's silence for decades, and was now being returned to the larger record of what had happened in that sky on that day. There is a discipline in historical accounts to focus on the survivors, and this is understandable because the survivors left testimony and the dead did not. But the dead have names, and the names belong in the record alongside the testimony. Joseph L. Russo, ball turret gunner, the little skipper. His remains were never found. He prayed over an open intercom without knowing anyone could hear him, and the crew of his aircraft heard him, and William Leak removed his helmet because he could not bear to listen and could not help, and understood that what he was hearing was private, in a way that the circumstances had made accidentally public. Russo knew what was happening to him, and he met it with his faith intact and his voice steady. That is what the record shows. Roy H. Little, waist gunner, the little skipper. He tried to crank open Russo's turret before he jumped. He could not. He jumped anyway because the aircraft was descending and there was nothing more he could do, and he did not survive the jump. His body was not recovered. Francis R. Chase, tail gunner, the little skipper. A replacement, which means he had been added to a crew that was not originally his, placed into a slot left by someone who had not come back, asked to trust men he had not had years to learn to trust. He jumped from the tail door of a burning aircraft over enemy territory, and he did not survive. William G. McNabb, pilot 9 lives. He tried to fill a gap in the formation. This is what the evidence suggests. He moved to take a position that the loss of another aircraft had opened up the same instinct that Rojan had acted on, and something in that movement combined with whatever wounds he had already sustained produced the collision. He did not survive it. Nelson Vaughn, co-pilot 9 lives. He was in the right seat when it happened. That is most of what the record says about him. He was there. Henry Etheridge, radio operator 9 lives. Dwayne Wrench and Francis Seyfried, who jumped and reached the water and died in it, whose names are in the records that Cindy Rojan spent years compiling. Elkin wrote that only 1/16th of an inch of aluminum separated the men inside those aircraft from everything that was trying to kill them that day. He wrote it to describe the feeling of flying through the German fighter attacks on the return from Hamburg, the awareness that the skin of the aircraft was the only thing between the crew and the convergence of firepower directed at the formation. But it applies equally to the whole day. 1/16th of an inch between the living and the dead, between the men who came home and the men whose names are on the records with the notation body not recovered, between Glenn Rojan drinking coffee in McKeesport 40 years later, and the alternative version of December 31st, 1944, in which William Leake followed the order to jump, and the aircraft went into its spiral, and the arithmetic came out differently. The difference between surviving and not surviving is sometimes a decision. Sometimes it is physics. Sometimes it is the distance between one man's ball turret and another man's, the fact that one turret could be manually rotated and one could not determined entirely by which aircraft each man was standing in when the two aircraft found each other at 19,000 feet. You do not fully choose which side of the 16th of an inch you land on. You do the work that is available to you. You make the decisions that remain within your power. You hold the controls with everything you have and keep the nose up as long as the nose can be kept up. And then the ground comes and the fire does what fire does, and the metal goes where physics sends it, and when it is over, the ones who are still breathing try to understand what they have just survived. Glenn Rojan tried to understand it for the rest of his life. He mostly did it quietly.